So now that we have concluded our overview of the axial skeleton, we can return our attention to the appendicular division of the skeleton. So recall that the appendicular division contains 126 bones in 4 distinct regions. We saw that those regions were the pectoral girdle, the upper limbs, the pelvic girdle, and the lower limbs. And also recall that the girdles function to unite the limbs to the axial skeleton, while the limbs enable us to carry out our body's movements. So we'll look at the 4 regions of the appendicular skeleton in this order that you see in the list here. So we'll start with the pectoral girdle. So the pectoral girdle, which is also known as the shoulder girdle, consists of a total of 4 bones. So we have 2 on each side of the skeleton. We have the 2 clavicles, which are the anterior bones of the pectoral girdle, and we have the 2 scapulae, which are the posterior bones of the pectoral girdle. Anteriorly, we see that the clavicles form a brace or a strut. So the clavicles, the right clavicle is located here in this diagram, and we see that the clavicles form a brace or a strut between the scapula and the sternum, and recall that the sternum is part of the axial division of the skeleton. So therefore, the clavicle is acting as a brace between those 2 structures. Posteriorly, we see that the scapulae do not actually directly connect or articulate with the vertebral column. That is, there's no direct bony connection between the vertebral column that you see here in the center of this diagram and the scapulae off to the left and right sides here. So the fact that there is no bony connection between the scapula and the vertebral column is actually what allows the pectoral girdle to be quite highly mobile. Really, the only thing that's holding the scapulae in place other than the clavicle on the anterior side is all of the musculature of the shoulder that, of course, we don't see in this diagram because this is simply a model of the skeleton here. But in an actual skeleton, there would be musculature of the shoulder, skeletal musculature of the shoulder that would hold and support the scapulae here. And there is also some musculature that connects the scapula to the vertebral column. But other than that, there is no direct bony connection between the scapula and the vertebral column. So that allows it or permits it quite a bit of movement. As a whole, the pectoral girdle has kind of 2 major functions. The first is to attach the upper limbs to the axial skeleton because the upper limbs attach to the scapula, and then the scapula is, of course, attached to the remainder of the axial skeleton by way of the clavicle there. So we're uniting the upper limbs to the axial skeleton, and the pectoral girdle also provides attachment point for muscles of the shoulder as well as muscles of the upper limbs. So now let's look at the individual bones of the pectoral girdle, and we'll start with the clavicles. Now the clavicles, which are also called the collar bones, are small kind of S-shaped bones that essentially function as a brace between the sternum and the scapula. They have a squared, flattened end that articulates with the scapula, and that end is called the acromial end, while the sternal end is more rounded and blunted. And as you have probably guessed, the sternal end is what articulates with the sternum. So here we actually see the connections a little bit more clearly between the clavicle and the scapula here. So here's the acromial end, which is making a joint with the scapula at a piece of the scapula that's called the acromion. So the acromial end of the clavicle meets the acromion of the scapula, and we have the rounded sternal end, which is butting up against the sternum. So the scapula, which are also called the shoulder blades, are triangular in shape, and they are located on the posterior aspect of the pectoral girdle. That is, they sit on the posterior side of the rib cage. Now, being triangular bones means that they have 3 borders. They have the superior border, the lateral or axillary border because of its proximity to the axilla or the underarm region, And then we also have the medial border on the opposite side of the lateral border. Being in close proximity to the vertebral column, the medial border is also referred to as the vertebral border. The anterior surface of the scapula, which you're seeing right here, rests against the surface of the rib cage, and as you can see, it's relatively smooth and flat, so that way it can glide over the surface of the rib cage without any kind of hindrance in its movement. Now, the posterior surface of the scapula actually has several bony projections that emerge from it because it's an important site of muscle attachment for muscles of the back, as well as muscles of the upper limb and, of course, the shoulder itself. So the first of these bony projections is this very noticeable spine kind of towards the superior border, which is also called the scapular spine, and it runs from the medial border to the lateral edge of the scapula. So this entire structure right here is the spine of the scapula. The spine actually terminates or ends at a flattened portion that's called the acromion, and this is the same structure that we saw a few moments ago that the clavicle forms a joint with. Slightly anterior to the acromion, so if we're turning our perspective here and looking once again at the anterior side of the scapula. So again, imagine we're kind of looking through the shoulder and looking through the rib cage, and this is what we would see. We see another bony projection here that's called the coracoid process. And this process is an anchoring point for the large biceps muscle that rests on the anterior part of the arm. Also, from this viewpoint or this perspective, we can much more clearly see a shallow depression in the lateral side of the scapula. It's called the glenoid cavity. And the glenoid cavity is the structure that forms the shoulder joint with the humerus.